All right. You made it. It's almost the end of the day and you're still here. So thank you for hanging out with us. First, I want to start off by saying on this topic in particular, I say this in every presentation that I do on disinformation. People believe what they see and hear first and what they see and hear the most. Think about that for a second. What we see on social media and what we see in the news, even if it's not true, we believe. It is ingrained in us and in our minds to believe it as truth. So essentially, we have a truth bias. Let me see if this clicker works. There we go. Women officials are targeted 3.4 times more often than men with violent threats. And we're going to talk about that today as we go into some more statistics.
And so then in addition to that, 78% of malign gender narratives posted to social media platforms in September and November of 2020 were directed at Kamala Harris. And this was among a cohort of 13 other women politicians that was just observed over this period of time. 78% was directed at one woman. Mm-hmm. Oh, right. And so this quote from MP Priyanka Chaturvedi, "I refuse, however, to just be a cog in the system and bow down to these cowards. I continue to persist despite the hate sent across my way every day." And this is women in history and probably the future, because this is the reality that we have all had to live with, and it just keeps evolving, unfortunately.
So before we dig into the topic of gender disinformation, specifically disinformation that targets women, I want to introduce myself. My name is Charity Wright. I'm a threat intelligence consultant at Recorded Future. We are a threat intelligence company. I started my career in the US Army, where I served for 10 years as a Chinese linguist. And I also worked at the National Security Agency for several years, analyzing intelligence. My specialization has been China. And I moved into private sector cybersecurity in 2015, where I've worked for a variety of enterprises in a threat intelligence role. And I came on board with Recorded Future in, I guess it's been almost 3 years as a researcher, where I've worked with Insect Group, our threat intel team. And recently I moved into a consultant role. So I get to work with some of the biggest private sector clients in America. And some of my research has included a continuing focus on China, cyber threats, dark web, cybercrime. And over the last few years, I've focused my work on disinformation and malign influence.
And I am Chelsea Wilson. I am a fraud intelligence editor at Recorded Future, and I'm part of our payment fraud intelligence team. My title says editor, but I am also a hybrid analyst role. So I have a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice that I received from a women's college in Pennsylvania, Cedar Crest College, if any of you know of it. And then I went on to get my Master of Arts in Forensic Psychology with a concentration in intelligence studies from Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. And so while I was in undergrad, I did an internship with the Lehigh Valley Regional Investigation and Intelligence Center, which is a fusion center for law enforcement and intelligence. And the way that they always described that place was basically an office of people who could go and do digital investigation work where detectives were needing to be on the street interviewing people. And that was a really cool initiative that I was able to see into. And while I was in graduate school, I did work with the University of Maryland's Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security, which is a mouthful. And so they're one of the Homeland Security Centers of Excellence, I believe. And so that was a very cool thing. I worked on natural language processing with them. I was supposed to be annotating, but government data doesn't always come through, so I never actually got to do anything while I was with them. And so then my areas of expertise here are clearly fraud intelligence, that is where I'm currently working, and then also threat actor profiling, which is kind of how I ended up here as forensic psychology. I like to look at why people do things and what they're thinking at that time. So what is gender disinformation? And so as defined by the United States Department of State, it is a subset of misogynistic abuse and violence against women that uses false or misleading gender and sex-based narratives, often with some degree of coordination, to deter women from participating in the public sphere. Technically, that definition tells us nothing new. And it's unfortunate, which is why it's funny. So who's creating it and who's spreading it? And so there is no one right answer for this. Officially, it is foreign, state and non-state actors, very much primarily Russia and Chinese actors, have been credited with some of the larger disinformation campaigns, usually targeted towards, for example, Kamala Harris, any of the women that are in political power positions to affect legislation in favor of democratic or more liberal policies that go against their beliefs or would strengthen the United States against their various efforts. And so then beyond any particularly official is also average and extremist citizens. And so one of the things that I want to point out here is that sexist attitudes and beliefs are factors most strongly associated with the support of violent extremism and participation in political violence. And so this was taken from the Sexism and Violence Nexus from the UN Women Council, I believe it is, which again, I don't think it's something that's very surprising to many of us to hear. But seeing it written down and officially reported was something that really resonated with me and almost made something click. January 6th was horrifying to watch and see, and kind of understanding that there is at least some sort of connection between sexism and the tendency to go out and commit political violence is scary and highlights the problem with gender disinformation and gendered abuse in general. Okay, so for recent findings with gender discrimination, we have a report that was released by the US State Department that was in conjunction with Canada, the European External Action Service, Germany, Slovakia, and the United Kingdom that went over several key findings which are spoken about elsewhere also in this presentation, but I also wanted to highlight here that we are talking about women with intersecting identities being one of the main targets. So not only women, it is women of color, it is women in the queer community, it is transgendered women. They are the most vulnerable to these kinds of campaigns. And beyond those actual identities, it can be using transgender narratives in a negative light. There were plenty of disinformation campaigns aimed at Kamala Harris about accusing her of being a transgendered woman who had a prior identity as a man that is harmful both for her and for the trans community, because that's just not true, and it is harmful in so many ways. And so then there's also the fact that it is often disseminated through coordinated, premeditated, and spontaneous social media activity. And so even when China or Russia are determining that they want to discredit a woman in power that's trying to do something, you're not always going to know just from seeing those social media posts or from hearing the reports that, there's meddling in the elections. Social media is a virus. It spreads like a virus. And so one rumor, one misinformation, one disinformation spreads like wildfire. And so social media compounds and absolutely exponentializes the problem. And so lastly, what I wanted to touch on here is that the ultimate goal of these campaigns is to discourage the freedom of expression and undermine democracy. Because let's face it, if there are no women in government, what is that government serving? I don't believe they're serving us, and I feel like we should all believe that. All right. And so there are a lot of consequences of gender disinformation. And so we have both psychological and physical trauma. So just because something happens on social media does not mean it stays on the internet. And even when it does stay on the internet, the trauma that someone can take from that is lifelong. You can absolutely have PTSD from some of the things that are happening on social media. And so you've got short-term distress from reading those comments. There may be rape or physical threats coming at you from your Twitter inbox, perhaps to your personal email if you've done something. Last year with the women at RFERG, we brought in Nina Jankowicz.
Yeah.
Nina Jankowicz, who was, actually, can you speak to that a little bit?
So if you're not familiar with Nina, she was appointed by President Biden to be a head of a disinformation governance board, which was shortly after disassembled because of disinformation around who Nina is and about her area of expertise and about her background. There were political accusations of her being biased towards one side or another, calling her names and threatening not just her political reputation and her reputation as an intelligence analyst and an expert, but also threatening her life and her family. Nina came to speak with us as a guest speaker in our office here in Arlington. And if you haven't seen her book, she has a wonderful book. It's called How to Be a Woman Online. I highly recommend it. And she talks about not just the disinformation, but the actual threats of violence and rape towards women. And she speaks from her own personal experiences, as well as on behalf of friends of hers that have experienced this as well. Many of them politicians, public speakers, or those with some kind of public presence, in addition to women that have identity as a minority or a religious minority, and these intersections. Women in politics are also highly targeted by discrimination and threats. So Nina came to speak with us about her personal experience, and the first half of her speech, I was extremely sad for her and her family and the threats they experienced. And then I was also inspired by her bravery and her courage to stand up against it. She did admit that she took down her presence on social media for a time in order to avoid the trolls and the harassment on Twitter. But she also re-ramped up her Twitter again when she found the resources she needed through friends, through coworkers who were supporting her. They did not stand up that disinformation governance board again because of how controversial it was. But Nina is an excellent, I think, role model, an example of how we can stand up against these types of threats. So if you haven't seen her book, definitely check it out.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for elaborating on that. I was a participant of that event, but I was not nearly as involved as Charity was in the setting up of that event. And so what I want to leave with this first section of our presentation with is the understanding that gendered disinformation is a subset of gendered abuse. And so gendered disinformation leads to gendered abuse. Gendered disinformation is a lot less prevalent than the abuse aspect, but it is no less impactful. And I mean, I would actually argue that it is more impactful than the digital abuse, because it can do so much damage, not only to the woman that it is targeted at, but also to anyone standing behind her, because of the pervasive thought factors that are changing based on what was seen first or what was seen most.
Yes. So I want to talk in the next section about how we analyze disinformation, and I'm going to show you an example at the end of how we can apply these frameworks to analyzing gendered disinformation. But first, let me ask you in this room, if you have a social media presence or an online presence at all, have you ever been targeted with sexism or discrimination online because of who you are, because of your public presence, because you're a woman in technology? The majority of the room has their hand raised. And let me tell you, the more publicly present you are, the more you put yourself out there to take opportunities and promotions and get up on a stage, the more likely you are to be targeted by that kind of gendered discrimination. But I challenge you to not let that make you cower away from those opportunities. Don't let them scare you away, because you have a room full of colleagues and friends who are going to be behind you to support you. So as we kind of explore this type of disinformation and the threats towards women, let's talk about how we analyze disinformation in general. The past few years, I've spent most of my research time analyzing influence operations, which is technically malign influence. There are nation state threat actors that conduct these operations. There are criminal disinformation as a service actors that do this. And then you've got your regular old your regular old Joe online who may have a problem with women, who may feel threatened by women in leadership or in power, and just the sexist, misogynist population around the world in general. So first, let me start by clarifying a few definitions. First, we want to look at the difference between misinformation, disinformation, fake news. How do we differentiate these terms? I like to say that misinformation it's not intentional. I say, let's say my grandmother is on Facebook and she sees a post that appeals to her belief system, politically or religiously, and she shares out a piece of information. She doesn't vet it. She doesn't know if it's true, but it appeals to her and she wants to share it out to share information with other people or get other people to agree with her, whatever the purpose is. Usually we don't put a lot of thought into these things. She's sharing out a piece of information. It's probably not true. It might be a little politically biased, and she doesn't mean any harm. She's just doing her thing on social media like, oh yeah, that sounds right. That's misinformation. It's shared without the intent to harm anyone. I think that is the most prevalent form of false information that we share because it appeals to our belief systems. And then we have disinformation, which is the harmful type. This is coordinated, malign information that is shared. It's sharing a biased information or a manipulated narrative. It is purposeful, it is crafted, and it is coordinated. This is where we see a lot of disinformation at the state-sponsored level. Let's say the Chinese Communist Party has a whole system of state media that they push out disinformation about the US or NATO or whoever their competitors are. It's crafted and it's coordinated. So quite often when we're looking at news or social media, you're probably going to be seeing friends and family and colleagues sharing misinformation. They're probably not like, I'm going to convince everybody that this thing is true. But we have to be aware of who we are really interacting with on social media, because you may see something and you think, oh, that sounds right, but you don't even know the person who's sharing it and what their intent might be. And then, of course, there's fake news. We've seen a lot of fake news over the past few years around COVID, around elections, all different types of politically charged material. Fake news is often purposefully crafted, sensational, emotionally charged, misleading, or totally fabricated information that mimics the form of mainstream news. So keep in mind, not all news sites or Twitter accounts that claim to be news are actually official news sources. It's very easy to spin up a website that looks like a real news site, use broadcasters that look like real news broadcasters. They could be paid actors. So just be very aware that there are malign influence operations that use these types of fake news. Any questions in the audience yet about these definitions or anything we're talking about? Okay. So now that we've got some clarification, I want to talk about a term called narrative warfare. Narrative is storytelling, right? We grow up reading books and reading stories. They all have some kind of storyline embedded in them. Narrative assigns meaning and identity to information. So if there is a malign influencer who is telling a fictional story about a woman politician, if they just say, so-and-so is blah, 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 maybe it may not have an impact on you because it's not you they're talking about. But once they assign meaning and identity, she is this thing because she is a Black woman. Those kinds of identity aspects suddenly are very targeted, and it makes you feel a certain way: emotion, defensive, hurt, violated, all of these emotions. Narrative warfare targets how you feel and how you react to a story. So it assigns meaning and identity. That's how we kind of identify narratives about women, is how it makes us feel, what it says about women in general, stereotypes and generalizations. And I think it's important to point out that in narrative warfare, the narrative is not necessarily true or false. It could be either one, and it doesn't matter. If you tell a convincing story, remember, people believe what they hear and see first, and hear and see the most. So anyone can make up a story, and if you repeat it over and over again, you're going to end up believing it. And you wonder, how did I even come to believe that? Now, we have a war, a narrative war on women happening around the world, but especially in particular countries where women don't have the same rights as we do in the Western world. So we have to pay very close attention to what story is being told about women in this particular society. In our society, the higher women climb in corporate ladders or political ladders, the more they are attacked with those malign narratives. So becoming aware of narrative warfare is, I believe, the first step. Any questions about narrative warfare? Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we analyze disinformation and influence operations at Recorded Future. We spent over a year just really evaluating all the frameworks that were already out there for analyzing disinformation. And we discovered that there were some great ones, but they were all addressing one particular part of a disinformation campaign. So we decided, why not create a holistic framework for analyzing influence operations based on the Diamond model, which is already very familiar to those of us in cyber threat intelligence. The original Diamond model was created to analyze cyber intrusion campaigns and the various aspects of it. We converted that to influence operations. And so really it consists of 5 components, as you see on the outside part. On the red axis is the socio-political axis. That means in a disinformation campaign, there's an influencer and there's an audience. Sometimes we can even include the target in the audience. So they have a direct relationship, whether that's hate, misogyny, sexism, you name it. There are various connections between the two. Now, influencers could be nation state level, criminal, political parties, or they can use proxy companies to conduct the disinformation campaign, like marketing companies or fake PR companies. They will sometimes spin up these proxy organizations to conduct it on behalf of a nation state. And then the audience could be at any particular level. It could be a global audience through, let's say, like a global news network like BBC or CNN. It could be a national or local level. It could even be small groups. Let's say they're targeting your neighborhood Facebook group, or they're targeting all InfoSec professionals on Twitter. Audiences range in size. And then on the other axis is the technical axis. On one side, we have capabilities. So we think, let's say TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And then on the other side is the infrastructure that they use to conduct the disinformation campaign. Capabilities, influence operations, TTPs could be, is it a large scale campaign or is it small scale? Are they using automated bots on social media? Are they using deep fake videos or photos or forgeries, let's say forged documents? And then you can also evaluate the influence operation based on their budget. Obviously, having all of these tools and capabilities requires some money and capability. And then on the infrastructure side, that's where you evaluate what technical aspects are there to this campaign. Are they using social media? Are they spinning up fake news websites, fringe news sites? Are they using news agencies? What IP addresses? So from a technical cybersecurity perspective, for infrastructure, you're looking at the digital artifacts of the campaign. And then when we put all of these pieces in their place, like a puzzle, we start to see the big picture. And in the middle of that big picture is always a narrative. It is always some kind of malign message that is intended for harm, whether that's to manipulate a particular group or to incite violence against women, there's going to be a narrative in the center of every malign influence operation. So how can we use the diamond model to analyze gender disinformation? We looked through various studies that have come out. There's several academic institutions and State Department, and we actually have a list of resources coming up in the slides for you. But as we look through all of these different campaigns against women, we decided to plug them into the diamond model. Now, the words on my screen are tiny, so I'm going to look at the big screen here. I guess I'm getting old, you guys. I can't see. So on the capabilities side, these are some of the capabilities we found for gender disinformation campaigns, which includes identity-based and political themes, shaming of women. That's something Nina brought up quite often. Discrediting your work, gaslighting you, creating deep fake photos and videos. And let me just say on that note, there are mobile applications that can be used to strip your face off of your photo and put it onto a porn site or a porn photo. Pornography was the predominant use case for gender disinformation when deepfakes started. It was, revenge against an ex-girlfriend, replacing her face onto somebody else's body, all types of shaming involved with female nudity, essentially trying to make us feel ashamed of our bodies and embarrassing us in public. These types of things get very serious, and I don't want to go too in depth, but they use memes, hashtags, public statements in press conferences about women, non-consensual distribution of nudes on websites, fake nudes, cyber stalking, extortion, and doxing. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. When you really start looking into the findings and how prevalent this is around the world, it's very concerning, not just as a woman, but for me as a mother of a little girl. We're raising our kids in this world where automation and technology can be used against us as a weapon. Is it going to go? There we go. Okay, infrastructure used includes social media, news platforms, message boards, and forums. Let's say Reddit, or they spin up a website, particularly for, hey, post your ex-girlfriend's nudes on here or sell her photos. Video platforms like YouTube, image sharing platforms, and like I mentioned, press conferences as well, when you get up high level into the political realm. Audiences all over the world, you name it, global, national, and local. Like we mentioned, this problem is especially concerning in nations where women don't have the same rights, say like Iran or Afghanistan, certain parts of the global South. But there's really no comparison. This is a huge problem in America and in the Western world as well, where technology is more available and women are more prominent in the political sphere. And the influencers, as with other influence operations, includes nation state, criminals, politicians, misogynists, extremists. I put haters in general, because I think no matter what you do, if you're a prominent woman, you're going to get some hate. I've had men approach me at conferences and tell me I didn't belong in this industry. And I'm like, thanks for reinforcing my imposter syndrome. But, we have to be able to have a support system around us to protect us from those types of accusations and hate. And ex-partners, by the way, former partner violence and partner violence is a huge problem in the world. And a lot of the hate stems from broken relationships and messed up things happening in relationships. And of course, we already addressed the narrative is misogynist, sexist material that they'll just pull anything out of the hat to use against women. I also wanted to show you another somewhat framework for analyzing disinformation. This one always sticks in my head. It's a little easier to remember. These are the 4 Ds of disinformation. I didn't write this. This was created by a prominent researcher named Ben Nimmo, who is now in charge of basically the disinformation threat operation at Facebook, Meta. The 4 Ds of disinformation is that the threat actor will try to use dismay, distort, distract, and dismiss against a target audience. For example, let's say I present a fact and the Chinese government counters that fact. Like a Chinese APT targeted this industry with this type of malware during these months of the year. And the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a press conference and says, let's say they dismiss it. We did not conduct that operation, and our policy remains that we do not use cyber threats against other nation states or companies. That's their policy. That's what they stick with. That's their line. They dismiss it. Then they may use a distraction and counter that accusation. Well, actually, the fact is the United States conducts these types of operations against countries all over the world, and they'll flip it back on the victim. These are common techniques, not just by gaslighting individuals, but nation states and influence actors use these techniques as well. So keep in mind, dismay, for example, if a form of disinformation is spread throughout the US about elections and says, all the election systems are broken and hacked, your vote won't count anyway. That's a dismay tactic. They're trying to get you to feel like, it's not even worth it for me to go vote. I'm not going to go vote. That's a common tactic we see from Russian influence operations targeting US voters. So a couple different ways to analyze disinformation. I want to, did I go backwards?
Yes.
Oh, I did. I pushed the wrong button. Okay, we have compiled a list of resources here. These are some of the resources we've used to inform our presentation today, and we want to share that in case you want to take a screenshot. Also, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, we can send you a copy of the slides. This list of resources includes online tools on the left side. These are free open source tools that you can go log into right now and start exploring various disinformation narratives, hashtags, and key phrases used in disinformation campaigns. And some of these tools will also aggregate those and just show you, these are the top trending narratives in certain news sources today. So we use some of these tools in our work as researchers. And on the right side is, it's not a comprehensive list, but it's a great list to start with. These organizations have written and published great research on this topic, and they are, kind of pioneering the research on disinformation against women. So we highly encourage you to check these out if you'd like more information on these. Okay, so at this point, we've talked about what gender disinformation looks like, what the consequences are against women, how we analyze disinformation, and some of the resources. So let's now pivot towards talking about the future. And I want to kind of ask Chelsea what she thinks. We decided to do a more conversational style to finish it off. And at this point, if you have questions about gender disinformation, we welcome you. I'm going to ask Chelsea a question and then we can kind of dig in more. But Chelsea, I'm wondering what you think the future of gender disinformation looks like.
I'm sure the entire room can help me answer this one because we're going to go with AI. The future of disinformation is absolutely lies within deep fakes, both the revenge pornography, where we have a statistic here. It says 96% of all deep fakes depict women in fabricated non-consensual pornography. But there's also the voice modules that are enabling threat actors and, funny people doing funny things on the internet to make someone say anything they want them to. There is also the use of AI, such as ChatGPT, to start creating false narratives that are incredibly believable. Because, as it is now, there are a lot of people who can't tell when something has been written by ChatGPT or written in conjunction with ChatGPT, and therefore there is a lot of risk in using those tools for malign reasons. So did we want to see questions now or go on to our next one?
Did anybody have a question about the future of AI? Or I mean, the future of gender disinformation? I
We all
cannot tell
have
you what the future of
questions.
AI looks like, but yes, in the back. Dun, 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 dun.
That is our next question.
I promise you,
Thank
we did not cue her.
All right. So yeah, our question here, beyond what is being done now, we also want to address, and I want to ask Charity, who's involved in this fight right now and what is going to be done?
So during our research, what we discovered was the US State Department has been working in conjunction with the EU and several law enforcement agencies around the world to research the topic of gender disinformation and the problem that's happening worldwide. Not only public sector researchers and folks, but there are task forces and nonprofits involved. There was one quote we included in our notes here. It says, because gender-based online harassment and abuse can transcend national borders and be an added dimension of violence in political and ethnic conflict, meaningful efforts for protection, prevention, and accountability require global, multi-sector action and coordination. And of course, in our slides, we include links to some of these things in the notes if you're interested in exploring more on this. But there is a global task force already formed right now that is tackling this problem. And I think what they're doing is really, let's start by promoting awareness. Because quite often when you're a target of gender disinformation, you may feel like you're the only one. You may feel very alone and isolated. As Nina told us, she would go home and cry to her husband, and she would fear for her life and her kids' lives as people were threatening to go to her home and harm them. And even if it's trolls on Twitter, I can't tell you how many times I've seen information security women be targeted by males online. I think we're getting better at kind of pitching in and countering some of that. Like, hey, leave my friend alone. What are you doing? I don't know how you counter that, but oftentimes they'll take it into DMs and target an individual there. I think raising awareness that you're not the only one and you're not alone in this situation, but even more so is, what are women in other countries facing and how does that look different for them? For us, it's usually through social media, or maybe they'll get your email address and God forbid they get your phone number and start texting you harassing messages. Stalkers go to great lengths to conduct their hate operations for whatever reason. So promoting awareness of the problem is number one. And that's why we're here, is helping to promote awareness of gender disinformation and how global it is. And then we can start getting involved with some of those nonprofits and some of those charities to go, okay, how can I help? Can I give a presentation on this? Can I inform people at my workplace through our Women's Employee Resource Group? Can I create a support group for other women in tech who are facing discrimination and sexism on a regular basis? After Nina gave her presentation to us, I reached out to her and let her know how much I appreciated her support and other women that have been in those situations, because I've been targeted by that kind of disinformation as well. So I think number one is awareness, and number two is actively getting involved in the community. And if you see something, say something. When that person is being targeted on social media, maybe stand up for them, maybe reach out via DM and say, I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Do you want to talk about it? Or can I help you in any way? And from a technical standpoint, we're trying to hold social media platforms accountable for the hate that is happening online. Racism, sexism, transphobia, you name it. We're trying to help counter that from the inside out from social media companies as well.
Being the voice of reason can sometimes be difficult and exhausting, but I do implore all of you to at least take some opportunity when you can, when you have the capacity to do so. I have to do it within my own family. and it's exhausting, but I do it every single time because I will not live with parents that don't understand these concepts and these problems and don't respect them. And so you don't have to be on top of it every day, all the time. But if even once you can help dissuade misinformation, I implore you to do so, because everyone in this room can fight this problem and we can all uplift each other. And we all should uplift each other. We're all fantastic, wonderful women and allies and otherwise. So thank you.
I just want to finish on one note. I am very hopeful that we're going to be able to counter and fight against gender disinformation, because we have some badass women in this world and in this room. So stick up for each other. Don't let the haters get to you. And if you need support, reach out to somebody around you. Reach out to myself or Chelsea or any of the women here from Recorded Future, and we're here for you. And on that note, I want to open it up to any questions that you may have.
Oh, we actually had one in the app.
Oh, okay. I think we may have a question online.
Yeah, there was a question in the app, so I'm not sure who asked it, but thank you. And so the question was, what is the risk of an ordinary person or an election judge being the target of such a disinformation campaign? And so I can take the first part of this at the very least and say the average person is not at a high risk for a disinformation campaign because they are often targeted towards a larger mission. And so there is something that that person or that woman is in charge of or in front of or pioneering that another group doesn't like. So your average ordinary person, highly unlikely. It is when you get into the online spaces, particularly online spaces, and start pioneering for a cause or become, say, the face of a cause or something where your risk starts to elevate and you have to protect yourself against those potential threats or being exposed to that kind of narrative violence. An election judge, which I will admit I did have to look up earlier because I've never heard of one of those. I would say that your risk would be higher than the average person, and that is because you are directly in charge of a place of polling. And just recently, I believe the settlement came between one of the election, the voting machine companies and Fox News was settled in the company's favor because it was everything that they were saying about the election being rigged was
False.
deemed it was false. It became defamation. And so an election judge could potentially be at a higher risk than your average citizen.
I agree. And I just want to second what she said about the election part. Election disinformation is prominent in the United States because we're in a battle for truth. Basically, we're in a war for truth. And that comes down to, was the election stolen? Are there problems with our electoral system? No matter what you believe politically, you have to be aware that there are narratives being pushed by both sides, and you have to try to differentiate official sources. One of our tasks at Recorded Future is protecting the election integrity, and we help serve the officials of the elections and any woman in a position of power, especially a politician, let's say a governor, vice president. Nancy Pelosi has been targeted by violence, unfortunately, and her husband was a victim of it as a result. Anytime you take on a position of power, especially in a political realm like elections, you're more likely to be targeted. And I think it's important to kind of make people aware, like, hey, I'm taking this role and I am excited about taking this opportunity, but we need to be aware of disinformation that may be targeting me and other females in this sector. That was a great question. Yes.
We know, like, to your politics stuff, that women don't all stand up for other women. So I'm wondering if you have data, been doing this research about what is a critical mass of, like, how many women need to start standing up for other women before it becomes some sort of shield.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that, but my guess is that as we become more aware and start pushing back against it and hold accountable the platforms that are allowing that type of hate, we'll see a reduction. Now, that does depend on the technology companies. As we've seen, we had a lot of researchers and investment into countering disinformation on social media and certain platforms. But we have seen some steps backwards in those particular platforms since the change of management happened. Certain leaders in technology companies value countering disinformation and value truth over others. And so I think as an industry, as a security industry, we're pushing this is critical. This will change the course of our democracy. This changes human rights around the world. We need to focus on this. But I don't know how many of us have to get involved. I don't have an answer to that. Do you?
I do not, unfortunately.
Spread the word. Yes, Amina.
So I was actually the one who asked that question in the app.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you.
Because as an election judge, that was one of my concerns in the last election, that, hey, I'm leading this polling location. What else could go wrong here that I can't control because it's not in front of me? It's
Yeah.
not, or what can I not control? Because there was the potential of violence. So, and having received some really possibly this kind of messaging on social media, one of the things I've been wondering is there a social media platform that does a better job of responding to these messages? Is there a way? I know it's probably like a question with a really disheartening response, but is there advice that you would give for that kind of thing?
I think we can't name and shame or name and praise, but I can say that look into which social media platforms have dedicated security teams. What resources are they putting into countering disinformation? And you'll know because they'll have a website that particularly addresses this problem and has reports on what they're doing to counter it. If they're not countering it, if they're not making any effort to counter any disinformation or influence operations, it's going to be pretty clear because they won't be addressing it publicly at all. So not only are we trying to push for that accountability factor, we're trying to push for government, no matter where you live, to take accountability of, hey, this technology is based in our country. We need to address human rights issues that are happening and the rise of extremism. I mean, the rise of extremism aligns with hate towards women. So there's a direct correlation. But yeah.